Hello and welcome to this home edition of Politics Today. And in today's programme, we'll be discussing the next political battle after Brexit, COVID, and that is to save the Union, with growing demands amongst Scottish nationalists, Welsh nationalists and those in Northern Ireland to have their independence, which would lead to the breakup of our United Kingdom. So to join me on today's programme, I'm joined by Donald Boyd, who is from the Scottish Christian Party, as well as very much being involved in Highland Friends of Israel, and also Michael McCann, the director of Israel-Britain Alliance. So it's the first time I've done Politics Today with two very distinguished Scottish, I would say, heroes. I'll start off with you, Donald, because this is your first time that you've been on Politics Today, and of course, you gave me such a warm welcome a couple of years ago up in Inverness when I spoke there on behalf of Israel. Can you share with us what you're involved in with the Scottish Christian Party, together with your work that you're doing for Israel with the Highland Friends of Israel?
Certainly, Simon, and thanks for having me on your programme. And we remember you in Inverness, and we appreciated very much what you had to say. And it was very informative for our people up here, what you could bring to bear on the Israel side of things. On the Scottish Christian Party side, I'm the leader of the Scottish Christian Party and have been for since 2010. And we are accepting that there are Christians in other parties, but their mouths are silenced when it comes to issues. And therefore they've got party managers which are stopping. I could give you lots of examples of this. And what we want are Christians in politics who can speak as Christians. That's a fundamental idea. On the alliance side of on the union side of things, I'll just say a quick word on the Highland Friends of Israel. I'm also the vice chair of the Highland Friends of Israel, and Highlands is, of course, one of the largest areas in Britain geographically. And so we've held a number of conferences, and Simon, you've been at one or two of them and given a lot of input. And although this is a relatively Christian part of the world, not many of them are well schooled on the modern Israel question. They know what the Bible is, but they don't know the modern thing. And so it's a very, very useful tool in this part of the world for teaching people what the current state of affairs is. Just to say one quick word about the union side of things, as we know, the SNP are riding high at the moment. And so we as a Christian party have to ask ourselves, what is our primary responsibility to our nation? Is it to just promote a party? Or is it to preserve the union, as you say? And we've taken the view that on this particular occasion, because it's such an important election, and you may have seen on the BBC that Professor John Curtis of the University of Strathclyde is the primary sophologist that the BBC uses, and he has said that this is, the most important constitutional election for a long time to come. And therefore, as Christians with a desire to show love to our neighbours, and I think that's an important point that we may come up on with regard to the SNP. But because of this, we feel that we've got to sink our own particular position and go into an alliance with anyone who wants to be in alliance to oppose Scottish National Party politicians. And there is such an alliance called the Alliance for Unity, which is supported by people from all sides of the political spectrum. And I'll come back to that if you want to, or I'll continue now. But we are going to be supporting that to show that our Christian concern for showing respect and love to the other nations in the United Kingdom, instead of the constant grievance politics, which is so common with Scottish nationalism.
And Michael, good to have you on this programme. It's good to be doing a programme really about Scottish politics and its impact it's having on the Union. And a couple of weeks ago, the Sunday Times carried out a survey amongst the populations both in Scotland and in Wales and Northern Ireland to engage where they are in terms of their desire for independence. So very troubling that 50% of Scottish people that were polled said that they support an independent Scotland, 51% in Northern Ireland and 31% in Wales all want their own independence. And also, this is a very troubling statistic as well here, that 71% of Scots under 34 are in favour of Scottish independence. So are we really seeing the end of the United Kingdom within the next decade?
Well, I would probably be accused of being patronising if I comment on that last statistic first, but that's the folly of youth in terms of you can't put an old head on young shoulders. We're in a very dangerous place in terms of the United Kingdom because of a conflation of different things happening at the same time. We've got, excuse me, in Scotland, I saw a picture today of, there's this big schism at the moment between Salmond supporters and Sturgeon supporters. And there's a picture of Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon with a poster and it says, once in a lifetime. Now, of course, they've abandoned the once-in-a-lifetime approach, and now it's a perpetual, as Donald just referenced, grievance against the United Kingdom, which means that they want an independent Scotland. But we have to bear in mind that the difference between Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland is that we've had a referendum, and it was a good margin of victory, 55-45, because people like me supported the Union. We were sacrificed the following year because it was so close to the general election that there wasn't, people were still aggrieved that they didn't get what they wanted. So when you've got an 84% turnout and 45% of the people vote to be an independent country, and then 6 months later you have a general election, and surprise, surprise, there was a landslide victory for the SNP, because that 45% of the 84% turnout became 45% of a 70% turnout across the country, which meant they had a sweep across the whole nation, aside from one seat that for the Labour Party anyway, which Ian Murray won in Edinburgh because of the particular demographics of his constituency. So you've got that backdrop to where we're coming next. So they've abandoned it's a once in a generation. And this is the dangerous part between party politics and elections for every 4 years or every 5 years to elect your MSPs or whatever. They've now conflated the constitutional question into their identity politics. And they'll claim, if they win the general election, general election in Scotland this coming May, they'll claim that that's a mandate for independence. But of course, it isn't, because there are people who will vote SNP because, for example, they were impressed at the way Nicola Sturgeon has spoken on COVID every single day of the week since the whole crisis started. And don't underestimate the power of someone being able to be on the TV every single day for 365 days. I mean, it's just an enormous amount of coverage. And of course, the crucial thing that we don't have in Scotland is Nicola Sturgeon can go on that TV, she can preempt decisions that are being made between the quartet of the four nations in private. She comes on and she announces early so that she upstages Boris Johnson or anyone else. And then she doesn't have to give one moment's notice to the whole economic climate of this terrible virus that we're facing, because whilst Rishi Sunak has to provide the finance across the whole of the UK to ensure that people on furlough and we're safe and all the other elements of the economy, she doesn't care about that. She wants the United Kingdom to fail economically, because that'll be another string to her bow to argue for independence. So the problem that we have is when we conflate constitutional politics, which is it should be once in a generation or once in a lifetime. My view is I was always taught a generation was 25 years. 2014 wasn't 25 years ago. There was a resounding victory, but they will use anything they possibly can to achieve the breakup of the United Kingdom. And here's the problem, Simon. The older generations won us through in 2014, and I class myself, people who over 40s and 50s and beyond, who understand the value of the union, who have been there through thick and thin. And the youngsters, and bear in mind they allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. Even my daughter told me at the time, I wouldn't have wanted to vote when I was 16 or 17, Dad. I mean, there's always people who are going to be immature, but the bottom line is they eventually become mature. I certainly don't think it's a good idea to give. I still believe that you're a child when you're 16 and 17, and I think that allowing that rollout of votes was another element, another string to their whole deception about how you can get out of the United Kingdom. And bear in mind, they only need to win one vote to make it happen. We have to continually defend the union. I think where I can see some light at the tunnel, if I was politically looking for this, and I'll finish on this point, is that when will people eventually get tired of the grievance that they continually to make? I mean, I know a lot of people, I'm sick. I can't turn the TV on with Nicola Sturgeon without immediately turning it off again, because I know what she's up to. But when the penny drops finally across the majority of the Scottish population, we might be able to put this issue to bed. But there is no doubt whatsoever we face real dangers right here and right now.
Donald, I was reading your blog just before this programme this morning, and you mentioned the grievance of politics, and we're having this discussion on this issue today as it relates to Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Nationalist Party. Can you give us examples of the grievance politics the SNP used to try and win over voters to support an independent Scotland? And the only answer I can see really that she has in terms of what would happen if Scotland gained its independence would be that we will join the European Union. Yeah. And that seems the only plan.
Yeah, fine, I'll do that. Can I just ride on the back of Michael's last point that they've only got to win it once, just got to win it once. This is very similar, remember, to the Israel situation, that if Israel has all these wars which it wins, but it's just got to lose it once. And so there's something very similar between these 2 points. And if I can just pick up what you mentioned with regard to the youth and the young people and what Michael was saying, we need to remember the SNP have been in control of education for over a decade. Not only are they failing in education, but I'm going to quote someone with regard to the educational programme. Professor Tom Devine is a professor of history, well known up here. And he didn't declare where he was standing before the independence referendum because I think he wanted to be, even-handed. But after it, he did declare that he was in favour of independence. So that lets you see where this quote is coming from. Now, he has said that the educational programme of our youth in our Scottish schools is like a propaganda list for the SNP. So, I mean, he is for independence, but he himself has to criticise the education that has been given in Scottish schools with regard to the separation from the United Kingdom. So, and the young people, Michael has mentioned that, you've got to remember teenagers, coming to the grievance side, you've got to remember teenagers as a group tend to be full of grievance. They're why can't I do this and why can't I do that? And so they are themselves tend to be, and as Michael says, they grow out of it, they mature. But we've got grievance politics. I'll give you some of the most obvious things. And English listeners will not be listening to much Scottish television, but you can always tell an SNP person, because when they talk of the Westminster government, it's always the Westminster government, not the government. The government for them means Scottish government. In fact, they are an administration, and they changed the term, just unilaterally changed it, started calling themselves the government, so that when they come on and they start talking about the government, they mean themselves. But if they're going to talk about Westminster, it's Westminster government. And this is powerful because language is powerful. Everybody is discovering what's happening if you use a certain language. That's what a lot of the modern debate is. And so we need to, as Christians, we need to be very careful that we are using our word, using it accurately. So that, for instance, if anything comes along, so we've mentioned the finance. Michael said that the Westminster's got to provide the money. Well, the new finance secretary for the Scottish Parliament, because the previous one got ditched because of his tweeting with a young man. But she took over, and she is herself a Christian, but she has repeatedly mentioned, we could do this if we had money. We could do this if we had money. And so putting across this fact, well, we can't actually do anything except we get more powers, in this case, more money. And then it's like a ratchet, you're ratcheting in your gains. We get one thing, then we ask for something more, and then we ask for something more. And so they're constantly, if something goes wrong, it's always Westminster's fault. And this, just like a teenager, just keeps on blaming someone else and will not take responsibility for their own situation. And our schools are 2 years behind the English schools. The NHS has got its own problems, and they always just find some statistic that they might just be doing quite well in, and they promote it. For example, just after Brexit, which I call Brexodus, we've had a Brexodus from the European Union. And but there was a thing about cockle shells or something like that. Hardly the greatest part of our economy, but because it was something they could point to, there was a bit of a difficulty. This was promoted, and as Michael says, Nicola Sturgeon is in front of the television every single day, and people are beguiled. And on that score, she keeps on saying, "Well, I can't allow this, and I can't allow that. I've got to do this, and I've got to do that." And I wrote a letter to the Glasgow Herald about this, which they didn't publish, of course, in which it seems as if everything decision's got to come through her. It's as if there's nobody else that can make a decision except herself. And if she doesn't agree with it, then it can't be done. And there's an element there that people, close observers, will be recognizing this control freakery that we have there. And there's you see, as a medical doctor, we're dealing with risk all the time. We're dealing with patients and having to assess how risky things are. But she's a lawyer, and lawyers don't like risk. And yet she's in charge of all these things. She doesn't know what it is to weigh up these things. She says she does, but if you listen to her language, it's always what I say. We're taking advice from these people, but the buck stops with me. Yeah. Well, I would hope she's got a cabinet. Is it cabinet government, or is it actually Nicola Sturgeon government? I've not heard this mentioned in public debate, and that's why I'm mentioning it for anyone who's listening who wants to pick it up and run with it. There's lots of things one could pick up and run. I mentioned them on my own blog post, donaldboyd.org, if I'm allowed to advertise it.
Absolutely.
I can have a look at it. There's lots of things. But I could go on, but I don't know if I've answered your question. I just get mentioned one thing about this constantly. If anything goes wrong, blame Westminster.
Michael, I just want to bring an interesting survey as part of this survey that the Sunday Times conducted a couple of weeks ago. And this is that only 22% of Scots polled believed that Boris Johnson was doing a good job in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, compared to 61% for Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister. So a double question really for you. The first one is, how is she managing to exploit this COVID-19 crisis to her own political advantage? And secondly, is it appropriate that we should be talking about Scottish independence at a time of international, even kind of global crisis as we all face COVID-19?
Well, this might sound like an oxymoron, but I think I live, and Donald lives, the both of us live in a totalitarian democracy because, and if people say, well, how can you describe it like that? It's because you have one single party dominating everything. And unusually, the vast majority of the public are going along with it and accepting it. And it's disconcerting that you've got your real hardcore independent supporters, the people that you'll go on a train on a Saturday afternoon and they'll be carrying a saltire and they'll be wearing a kilt and they'll be doing all that sort of stuff, And the position is that, my view is that in terms of Nicola Sturgeon, she's been on the television a lot, as Donald has highlighted just a few moments ago. The position is that if they don't go, if they could give people, if they could argue they could give people 120% of their wages during furlough, then they would do it, and they would say, well, they won't let us do it. We wanted to give you more money, and of course, the vast majority of people don't understand economics, and I think I mentioned this in one of your shows before, Simon. They don't understand how we borrow money, how that becomes bonds, and therefore how we then, in order to maintain our credibility as an economic nation, we have to pay those loans back before we spend money on anything else. And the problem is that the finance minister that Donald referred to, I've seen this lady on the television, and she's completely bereft of arithmetical ability. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we, because of the nature of the Highlands is a classic example, the reason we got the Barnett formula was because we recognised that there were some parts of the United Kingdom that were huge, but very sparsely populated, and there was money distributed to enable communities to continue and flourish. And that's why, for example, when I used to be a trade union official looking after Highlands and Islands Airports Limited, back then, we subsidised to the tune of millions of pounds an airline, a network of airports. Why? Because if you had to make them economically viable, you couldn't have them. So this was about lifeline services, people who maybe had complications in their birth in the islands of Scotland getting flown to the mainland to get the hospital treatment that they deserved. All of this because we work with the strength of the union. So Sturgeon is, every time she can't do something, she'll say to the people on the television in Scotland, I would do it, but they're tying my hands. Not telling the people that if we were independent, we wouldn't have the money to do the things that she claims we could do. In terms of Boris Johnson, Boris is a very unfortunate politician because he had this caricature that he created for himself as a London mayor, which was all about buffoonery and not taking himself too seriously. And the problem is, when you become the Prime Minister, then you can't be a buffoon. And I think he's become a lot more serious in the last few months. And quite frankly, when I see his demeanour at times, I think that's what you should have done from day one, because you have to have the gravitas as a Prime Minister. And yes, he has made a mistake. He's made mistakes, but only when you look at it from the benefit of hindsight, when you look back the way. Because what they were trying to do, Rishi Sunak and the Prime Minister, was to balance the competing demands of people's health and the economy, recognising that the two things were linked, not just by COVID-19, but as we know about all the other illnesses that people have had during this extremely difficult time. I think he's not been given enough credit, and quite frankly, that Nicola Sturgeon and SNP should face more criticism about the way they've handled the vaccine rollout. Scotland would not be having vaccines if it had been an independent nation of 5 million people. We would not have been front of the queue. We would not have had the economic muscle to do what the British government has done on behalf of us all. And quite frankly, I don't believe that Boris Johnson and his government have been given enough credit for that. And I was delighted when he came up to Scotland last week, because the fact that the SNP were squealing so hard was because they didn't want people to hear that message. And we have to keep on delivering that message. And people like Donald, who have put aside his political agenda for this election to create an alliance, because Donald won't agree with everything that the other people he will be combining with. I mean, I think that's what we need to do. And, you know, and I'll finish on this point, the problem we've got up in Scotland is that we haven't got an opposition. We haven't got an opposition. We've got a party which has dominated the landscape for more than a decade. And ever since Alex Salmond's narrow win in 2007 by 1 seat, and Labour can blame themselves for that because they created that monster. And now we're facing the consequences. But we have to see this battle off. I'll be alongside Donald in the trenches fighting for the United Kingdom. And I'm confident we can win. And I'm confident that when Sturgeon goes, the SNP are going to look a pretty lame party, because there are no other contenders for her position that would have the same gravitas, the same weight as herself, or indeed her predecessor Alex Salmond, who were two. Well, you can say everything you want about them, but they are two big political hitters.
Guys, we only got 4 minutes left of the programme, so if we can just kind of summarise very, very quickly. Donald, on to you, really. What will it mean for Scotland if the Scottish people again get another referendum and the Scottish people vote to leave the Union? What would this mean for Scotland?
No. Boris will not give them a referendum. He will not want the Union to break on his watch. He won't get it. It will stoke up a lot of resentment in Scotland, but they won't get it. The second thing is when Churchill were at Dunkirk and everybody thought we're going to lose things, Churchill says, supposing we don't get these people back, he says, we will continue to fight. And therefore, we should not even be thinking in terms of, you know, what if, what happens when, because we just got to say it will not happen. Because if you start thinking like that, it makes them say one more push and we'll get there. And just so that you know, the Alliance for Unity in Highland here is actually being led by Professor Alan Sked of the London School of Economics. And he is the father of Brexit. He was there before Nigel Farage was there. He is the one that is really the Brexiter. And he is fighting hard for the alliance. and he's written a series of articles on it, and I'm supporting him to get that message across. And he's done an article on that very point about people should not be getting fear and thinking to themselves that these people are going to win. We've got to be strong and not even think in terms of them winning. And if you start debating what happens after that, that just gives them say, well, one more push and we'll be there. But Michael's answered it already in the sense that we don't have the economic strength. They will just want to rejoin the EU. The arguments are very well rehearsed up here, maybe not so well known in England, but they'll just want to rejoin the EU. The point is the EU will not want them. Spain will not want them because of Catalonia. And so they haven't presented a viable case on their side of what would happen, but they would not be an independent country. They would want to go back into the EU.
Absolutely. So 2 minutes left. Michael, in summing up, essentially, we're talking about the possibility here of the breakup of the United Kingdom in the next decade or so. And considering that Boris has just delivered Brexit and we've left the European Union, isn't it important that our nation stands strong? And that's Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland in the world together, where we have a common bond that has kept us together because of our Judeo-Christian heritage for hundreds of years.
I agree 100%. I think if you want to put in a nutshell my view in terms of the politics of it, and I agree with Donald that we don't move on to their territory, but the people that argue for it want to say that we don't want to be subservient to a United Kingdom government, but we do want to be subservient to a European government. And if we've looked in over the last few weeks about what that means, is that we saw the real face of Europe when they threatened to cut off our vaccine supply because they made a complete and utter mess of it and didn't get their act together, thinking the 27 nations remaining in the EU, thinking somehow that they would negotiate better deals than the United Kingdom. So in terms of our history, I think about my father-in-law George, who served in the army. I think of my father, who done his national service. I think about all the stories he told you about the people he met from London and the Scousers and their Welsh friends, and how the jocks were part of that whole camaraderie. And bear in mind, with Donald evoking the memory of Winston Churchill, how we came together as a nation and defeated the enormous threat that fascism offered this country during the Second World War. The bottom line is we are still far, far, far stronger together as four nations as we would be as individuals. And that's why I am utterly convinced that is why we will eventually win this debate, and will wash away the ego politics that we've had in this country for some time through Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon.
So, Michael and Donald, I want to thank you so much for being my guests on this home edition of Politics Today. And I thank you for watching this important programme, because Brexit is out of the way. The government is currently battling and confronting COVID-19, and the next political battle on the agenda will be to save the union. So we have to pray that the union stays together and fight for this, because this has been part of our heritage for hundreds of years, and together we can stand strong in the world. So thank you for watching Politics Today.